African brands are still clawing their way into the hearts of Africans. That's according to a report released today by Brand Africa. Business reporter Ntokozo Khumalo spoke to Brand Africa founder Thebe Ikalafeng ahead of a continental reveal of this report. Let's take a look.
Well, Brand Africa has today released its list of the most admired brands on the continent and surveyed 32 countries that account for about 85% of the continent's GDP and population. And for a little bit more insights on the list, I am now joined by Brand Africa founder and chairman Thebe Ikalafeng. Thank you so much for talking to us. Now, this list is 13 years in the making. Could you give us maybe an aerial view of what this year's findings were when it comes to those brands that are admired across the continent?
Happy Africa Day. I think that's a perfect place to start. But I wish it could have been even a Happy Africa Day if I could tell you that for the last 13 years, only 20% of the brands that Africans admire are African. So it's not quite a Happy Africa Day from that part of the statistic. And looking at this year, the list that we're releasing today on Africa Day, the African brands have tumbled from a high over the last 10 years of 70% to this year at 14%. So we've really regressed in the area of building brands that Africans admire. And I think it's a challenge for us because when you're looking at the momentum with the AFCFTA, you're looking at the optimism and the pride in Africa, the excitement about being African that hasn't necessarily translated to made in Africa as the first choice.
What would it take for African brands such as MTN, but also emerging brands to build that longevity of remaining admired brands in the long haul?
I think the challenge that African brands are facing, of course, has to be the lack of research. I mean, if you look at the research collectively for the continent, only about less than 1% of GDP is invested in research. And also, if you look at from a trademarks in terms of intellectual property, less than 2% of the trademarks or the intellectual property that is registered globally is of African brands. So we really need to do a lot better when it comes to research because research leads to innovation. Second, we need to do better in terms of our intellectual property because intellectual property means that we are owning our ideas and we are leveraging and we are sweating our ideas. What we need to do better still is to really own the hearts of Africans.
And Thebe, talk us through some of the emerging brands that are still upcoming. I know that in the list we saw Zambia come out with some strong brands there. What role do they play in really growing and scaling to become admired brands on the continent?
What we love and what we're beginning to see and admire about African brands is that African brands are generally, are mostly transformational. They create a better life. They make life better or different for African consumers. And secondarily, they reflect who they are.
Thebe, thank you so much for talking to us today. Of course, that was Thebe Ikalafeng, who is the founder and chairman of Brand Africa, just talking us through the 13th edition of that list that takes a look at some of the most admired brands on the continent and talking us through, of course, the brands that have remained in the top of the list, but also some of those emerging brands that are still coming up on the continent and the work that really needs to be done to build more brands in Africa that people can be proud of, respect and admire. For Newzroom Africa on channel 405, I'm Ntokozo Khumalo in Bryanston.